Welcome to where time falls quiet.
Göbekli Tepe and the Anunnaki, a temple before farming? Take a moment to subscribe, so this place of calm is always here for you. What if everything you were taught about the beginning of civilization was a carefully constructed lie? Not a lie born of malice, but one born of ignorance, a story we told ourselves because the truth was buried so deep beneath sediment and time that we convinced ourselves it never existed at all. What if the gods of ancient Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki, weren't myths invented by primitive minds trying to explain thunder and harvest? What if they were real, flesh and bone, walking among humanity until something catastrophic erased them from existence in a single, violent moment 13,000 years ago? This is not another video recycling the same theories you've heard a dozen times before. We're not here to speculate wildly or weave together disconnected fragments into a convenient narrative. What you're about to discover is something different, something that will require you to hold two contradictory ideas in your mind simultaneously. The first, that human civilization, as we know it, began around 6,000 years ago in the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia. The second, that this beginning was not a beginning at all, but a desperate resurrection, a frantic rebuilding by survivors who inherited knowledge they could barely comprehend, let alone replicate. The archaeological record speaks in whispers, and if you listen carefully enough, those whispers become screams. Imagine standing in the ruins of Uruk, the world's first city according to conventional history, where writing was supposedly invented around 3,200 BCE. The clay tablets are still there, preserved by the dry desert air, covered in cuneiform script pressed into soft clay by hands that have been dust for 5 millennia. But here's what they don't tell you in textbooks. The writing doesn't evolve. There are no practice runs, no crude attempts that gradually improve. The script appears fully formed, sophisticated, complete with a complex grammatical structure and an already established vocabulary for concepts that shouldn't exist yet. Words for cosmic catastrophe, for planetary mechanics, for genetic inheritance. The Sumerians themselves never claimed to be the first. Read their own texts carefully, and you'll find something unsettling. They describe themselves as inheritors, as students copying from masters who came before. The earliest king lists don't begin with human rulers. They begin with gods who reigned for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years, before a great flood divided history into two epochs, before and after. Modern scholars dismiss these numbers as mythological exaggeration, the kind of hyperbole you'd expect from ancient people with no concept of real chronology. But what if those scholars are wrong? What if the numbers aren't metaphors but measurements, astronomical calculations encoded in a format that could survive the collapse of the very civilization that created them? Consider this. The Sumerian King List records 8 rulers who reigned before the flood for a combined total of 241,200 years. Impossible, obviously. But divide those numbers by 3,600, the length of one complete precession cycle as understood in ancient astronomy. And suddenly you're not looking at the lifespans of individuals. You're looking at the duration of astronomical ages, periods of time measured not in human years, but in the slow wobble of Earth's axis as it completes one full rotation against the background of stars. The ancient Mesopotamians didn't just observe the stars. They measured time itself using cosmic mechanics we didn't rediscover until the invention of modern telescopes. Now travel west, across the desert to the Giza Plateau, where 3 massive pyramids rise from the sand in perfect geometric alignment. You've been told they were built as tombs for pharaohs around 2500 BCE, monuments to human vanity constructed by thousands of workers dragging blocks up ramps. But stand at the base of the Great Pyramid and look up at stones weighing 70 tons fitted together with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, and ask yourself, where are the practice pyramids? Where are the failed attempts, the collapsed prototypes that should litter the landscape if this technology was being developed from scratch? They don't exist. The pyramids appear in the archaeological record like the Sumerian script, suddenly, completely, impossibly sophisticated. The conventional explanation is that there was a rapid burst of innovation, a cultural revolution that took Egypt from primitive settlements to architectural mastery in just a few centuries. But the evidence tells a different story. The inventory stela, discovered at Giza in the 19th century, describes the Sphinx as already ancient when Pharaoh Khufu ordered repairs to it during the 4th dynasty. If the stela is authentic, and there are compelling reasons to believe it is, then the Sphinx predates the pyramids, possibly by thousands of years. And the Sphinx itself carries proof of this antiquity carved into its body. Deep, vertical erosion channels that could only have been created by sustained rainfall, by water cascading down limestone for centuries. The last time the Giza Plateau experienced that kind of rainfall was during the African humid period, which ended around 5500 BCE, more than 2,000 years before Egyptologists claim the Sphinx was built. Let that settle in your mind for a moment. Water erosion in a desert, a monument weathered by rain that hasn't fallen in 7,000 years. This isn't speculation. This is geology, the language of stone and sediment that doesn't lie, doesn't exaggerate, doesn't worship gods or kings. The rocks remember what we've forgotten. But here's where the silence becomes deafening. Around 10,800 BCE, something happened to the planet. Not gradually, not over the comfortable timescales we prefer for geological change, but suddenly and catastrophically. Ice cores from Greenland show a spike in atmospheric platinum, iridium, and other rare Earth elements, signatures of an extraterrestrial impact. Geological layers across North America contain a black mat of carbon dated to exactly this period, evidence of continent-wide wildfires. Megafauna that had survived multiple ice ages went extinct within a geological instant. And in the Middle East, in the fertile valleys where the Tigris and Euphrates would later flow through Sumerian cities, there's a clear stratigraphic break, a layer of sediment that marks the boundary between two different worlds. The ancient texts call it the flood. Not a localized event, not a river overflowing its banks during spring thaw, but a planetary catastrophe that reset human civilization. Every culture that survived remembers it. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis, the biblical Genesis account, Hindu texts describing Manu's Ark, Chinese legends of Gunyu, taming the Great Flood. These aren't independent inventions of similar stories. They're echoes of a shared trauma, fragments of a collective memory passed down through generations who witnessed the end of their world. And somewhere in that cataclysm, the Anunnaki vanished. The gods who the Sumerians insisted had walked among them, who had taught them writing and mathematics, and agriculture and law. They simply stopped appearing in the historical record after the flood. The kings who came after claimed divine ancestry, wore the symbols of divine authority, built temples to honor gods who no longer answered prayers. But they were human, mortal, ruling over survivors who could no longer create the wonders their ancestors had built because the builders themselves were gone. This is what we're going to explore together, not as believers or skeptics, but as investigators examining evidence that has always been there, hiding in plain sight beneath layers of conventional interpretation. We're going to follow the trail of the Anunnaki through Sumerian mathematics, through Egyptian engineering, through geological catastrophe, and through genetic anomalies in our own DNA that suggest our species encountered something, or someone, that left permanent marks in our chromosomes. We're going to ask uncomfortable questions about monuments that defy their supposed construction dates, about knowledge that appears without precedent, about a global cataclysm that coincides exactly with the disappearance of beings ancient humans insisted were not myths, but memories. Because if the Anunnaki were real, and if they vanished in a 13,000-year cataclysm, then everything we think we know about who we are and where we came from is wrong. And more importantly, the knowledge they left behind, buried in temples, encoded in myths carved into stone, might be the key to preventing the next reset, the next flood, the next silence that erases everything we've built. The gods didn't abandon us. They were taken. And what remains is a message written in stone, mathematics, and DNA, waiting for us to finally learn how to read it. There exists a clay prism, no larger than a wine bottle, housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. Its surface is covered in cuneiform script so precise that each wedge-shaped impression catches the light differently, creating shadows that make the ancient text appear to breathe. This is the Weld Blundell prism, the most complete copy of the Sumerian King List ever discovered, dating to approximately 2000 BCE. Its content is what archaeologists politely call problematic, because it describes something that should be impossible. 8 kings who ruled the city of Eridu before the Great Flood, reigning for a combined total of 241,200 years. Modern scholarship treats these numbers with academic embarrassment, filing them away in the category of mythological exaggeration alongside other ancient impossibilities. The standard interpretation goes something like this. Primitive peoples had no real concept of chronological time, so they inflated the reigns of legendary rulers to make them seem more impressive, more divine, more worthy of reverence. It's the same explanation given for the biblical patriarchs who supposedly lived for 900 years, or for the Egyptian god-kings whose reigns stretched across millennia. We smile at these ancient claims the way parents smile at children's fantasies, certain we know better, certain they were simply making it up as they went along. But the Sumerians were not primitive. They invented the wheel, the plough, the sailboat, and the first written legal code. Their mathematical system was base 60, sexagesimal, which is why we still divide our hours into 60 minutes and our circles into 360 degrees. They calculated the synodic period of Venus with such precision that their numbers differ from modern measurements by less than 1%. These were not people who confused fantasy with record-keeping. When they wrote something down in their bureaucratic, almost obsessively detailed administrative style, they meant for it to be understood as fact, as data, as information preserved for future generations who would need to know. So what were they actually recording? Look at the first king on the list, Alulim of Eridu, who supposedly ruled for 28,800 years. Write that number down. Now divide it by 3,600. You get exactly 8. The second king, Al-Algar, ruled for 36,000 years. Divide by 3,600 and you get 10. The pattern continues through all 8 pre-flood rulers. Every single reign, when divided by 3,600, produces a whole number. This is not coincidence. This is not mythological inflation. This is astronomy. 3,600 years is 1/10 of a full precessional cycle, the time it takes for Earth's axis to complete one rotation through the zodiac constellations. Ancient astronomers called this movement the Great Year, measuring it by tracking how the position of sunrise on the spring equinox shifted slowly westward through different constellations over millennia. One complete cycle takes approximately 25,920 years, but the Sumerians rounded it to 25,920 for their calculations. Divide that by 72, the number of years it takes for the equinox position to shift 1 degree, and you arrive at 360, the number of degrees in their astronomical calendar. These weren't just watching the stars for agricultural purposes. They were measuring cosmic time on scales that dwarf individual human existence. The Sumerian King List isn't recording how long individual rulers lived. It's recording astronomical ages, periods of cosmic time measured in units of 3,600 years, each unit representing a significant fraction of the precessional cycle. Alalim's 8 units equal 28,800 years. That's approximately one complete precession. Alalgar's 10 units equal 36,000 years, more than one full cycle. The text isn't saying these kings were immortal biological entities. It's saying they represent dynasties, ages, epochs marked by astronomical events that ancient peoples tracked with the same bureaucratic precision they used to count grain and livestock. But here's where it gets unsettling. The King List makes a sharp distinction, a clear demarcation that cannot be overlooked. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The post-flood kings are different. Their reigns are measured in normal human lifespans, tens or hundreds of years, not thousands. The first king after the flood, Ga-ur, ruled for 1,200 years, according to the list. Still impossibly long by our standards, but a tiny fraction of the pre-flood rulers' reigns. And with each successive generation, the numbers decrease. By the time you reach kings, we can verify through archaeological evidence, rulers whose names appear on artifacts and whose construction projects leave physical traces, the reigns have dropped to normal human durations. 20 years, 40 years, 53 years. The text isn't describing evolution or gradual development. It's describing devolution, a steady decline from something greater to something lesser. The pre-flood rulers weren't ancestors learning to become civilized. They were the standard from which everything after fell short. And the Sumerians knew it. Their own texts describe the post-flood period not as a beginning, but as a restoration, a frantic attempt to recover knowledge that had been lost, to rebuild cities on foundations that were already ancient when the water came. Now consider the mathematical knowledge embedded in these numbers. To create a calendar based on sexagesimal counting, you need to understand that 60 is the lowest number divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, the most computationally efficient base for a civilization without calculators. To measure precession, you need centuries of continuous astronomical observation, tracking the position of stars across generations, and recording the data with such precision that patterns spanning thousands of years become visible. The Sumerians had this knowledge in the earliest phase of their civilization. There are no practice runs, no gradual development from crude sky watching to sophisticated astronomical mathematics. The knowledge appears fully formed in the archaeological record, as if someone handed them a manual and said, "This is how you measure time. This is how you track the cosmos. This is how you preserve this information so it survives the next catastrophe." The Epic of Gilgamesh Perhaps the world's oldest surviving work of literature contains a detail that directly connects to this astronomical framework. Gilgamesh travels to meet Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah who survived the flood, by building an ark according to divine instructions. The journey takes Gilgamesh through 12 leagues of darkness, and when he emerges, Utnapishtim tells him something crucial. The gods decided to send the flood after humanity had become too numerous and too noisy, disturbing the sleep of the divine. But before the flood came, the god Ea warned Utnapishtim in a dream, instructing him to abandon his possessions and build a ship with precise measurements. A perfect cube, 120 cubits on each side, divided into 7 levels. Those numbers matter. 120 appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian astronomical texts as a key ratio for calculating planetary motion. 7 levels correspond to the 7 classical planets visible to the naked eye: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. The Ark wasn't just a boat, it was a 3-dimensional model of the cosmos, a symbolic representation of the celestial mechanics that governed time itself. Utnapishtim wasn't just surviving a flood. He was preserving knowledge, carrying astronomical data through the catastrophe in a form that could be rebuilt, reconstructed, remembered. And here's the question that should make your skin prickle. Why would a Bronze Age civilization obsessed with measuring cosmic time and preserving astronomical knowledge through catastrophe? Unless they had experienced catastrophe before, unless they inherited this obsession from predecessors who watched their world end and understood that knowledge, especially mathematical and astronomical knowledge, was the only thing that could survive the reset. The Sumerian King List doesn't begin with humans learning to be civilized. It begins with beings who already possessed complete understanding, who measured time in cosmic cycles, and who taught survivors how to preserve that understanding when the inevitable flood came again. The clay tablets don't say the Anunnaki were myths. They say the Anunnaki descended from heaven, established kingship, taught humanity the arts of civilization, and reigned for impossibly long astronomical ages before the flood swept them away. The post-flood kings claimed descent from these beings, wore their symbols, built temples in their honor, and spent millennia trying to recreate what had been lost. But they were copying, not creating. They were students working from incomplete notes, translating a language they could read but not fully comprehend. The numbers were never meant to deceive us. They were meant to preserve something too important to lose, a measurement system that could survive the collapse of the civilization that created it. Encoded in a format that any future society with sufficient astronomical knowledge would eventually decode. We are that future society. And the message the ancient scribes preserved in their king lists is finally becoming clear. Before the flood, something was here that understood the cosmos, with a sophistication we're only now beginning to recover. After the flood, humanity spent thousands of years trying to remember what they taught us. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was conducting a routine survey in southeastern Turkey when he stumbled upon something that would eventually force a complete rewrite of human prehistory. The local farmers called the place Göbekli Tepe, which translates roughly as Potbelly Hill, an unremarkable name for what appeared to be just another low mound rising from the Anatolian plateau. But beneath that mound lay something impossible, a massive temple complex featuring carved limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons each, arranged in circular formations, decorated with intricate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. The radiocarbon dates came back, and they defied everything archaeologists thought they knew about the development of human civilization. Göbekli Tepe was built around 9,600 BCE, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the pyramids, and most disturbingly, at least 1,000 years before humans were supposed to have invented agriculture, pottery, or settled communities. The standard model of human development follows a clear progression. First came hunter-gatherers living in small nomadic bands. Then came the agricultural revolution, when humans learned to domesticate plants and animals, which led to permanent settlements. Those settlements grew into villages, which eventually became cities, which finally developed the organizational complexity necessary to build monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe shatters this model completely. The builders were still hunter-gatherers according to the archaeological evidence. No domesticated grains, no evidence of permanent housing, no pottery kilns or storage facilities. Yet somehow, these supposedly primitive people quarried 20-ton limestone blocks from bedrock, using nothing but stone tools, transported them to the hilltop, carved them with elaborate three-dimensional reliefs of predators and birds, erected them in precise geometric circles, and then buried the entire complex under thousands of tons of fill dirt before walking away. The conventional explanation is that religion came before civilization, that the desire to build sacred spaces motivated humans to develop the social organization and technical skills necessary for monumental construction. But this explanation requires us to believe that hunter-gatherers with no prior experience in architecture spontaneously invented advanced stoneworking techniques, geometric planning, astronomical alignment, and organizational logistics sophisticated enough to coordinate the labor of hundreds or thousands of workers. It requires us to believe they did all this, completed at least 20 circular temple structures over a period of several centuries, and then deliberately buried their achievement under artificial hills before returning to their nomadic lifestyle. The hypothesis raises more questions than it answers. What if Göbekli Tepe wasn't the beginning of architectural knowledge, but the end of it? What if the builders weren't inventing techniques, but preserving them, using the last remnants of pre-cataclysm knowledge to create a message in stone that could survive the next reset? The site sits at an elevation of approximately 2,500 feet above sea level, high enough to have survived the flooding that accompanied the Younger Dryas impact around 10,800 BCE. The buried temples would have been protected from erosion, looting, and the gradual decay that claimed lower elevation structures. And the carvings themselves tell a story of catastrophe, predators surrounding human figures, serpents and scorpions in aggressive poses, a carved stone depicting what appears to be a comet or meteor swarm in the night sky, with headless human figures below. Now travel southwest to Egypt, to the temple complex at Abydos, where the Osirion sits half submerged in groundwater behind the temple of Seti I. The temple itself is conventional New Kingdom architecture, covered in hieroglyphs proclaiming Seti's devotion to Osiris and decorated with the typical religious imagery of 19th dynasty Egypt, around 1280 BCE. But descend the stone stairway behind the temple, and you enter a different world entirely. The Osirion is built from massive red granite and limestone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, fitted together without mortar using a technique called polygonal masonry, where each block is shaped to interlock with its neighbors in irregular patterns. The walls show no hieroglyphs, no decorative carvings, no paint or plaster, just bare stone cut with such precision that you cannot slide a knife blade between the joints. Egyptologists attribute the Osirion to Seti I, or his son Rameses II, dating it to the 19th dynasty around 1300 BCE. But the architectural style is completely different from every other structure built during that period. New Kingdom temples use small, easily manageable limestone blocks stacked with mortar. The Osirian uses megalithic construction techniques that appear nowhere else in dynastic Egypt except in one location: the Valley Temple at Giza, which sits next to the Sphinx, and is conventionally dated to the 4th dynasty around 2500 BCE. The two structures could have been built by the same hands using the same techniques, except they're separated by more than 1,000 years, according to official chronology. Unless the chronology is wrong, unless both structures are far older than their supposed construction dates, built using knowledge that existed before dynastic Egypt, before the pharaohs, before the hieroglyphic script that covers later temples. The Osirian sits 20 feet below the current ground level, buried under centuries of Nile silt. When archaeologists first excavated the structure in 1903, they had to pump millions of gallons of water from the interior chambers. The structure shows clear evidence of long-term water exposure, not surface runoff, but sustained immersion, as if it had spent centuries underwater before being buried by sediment. The Nile hasn't reached that elevation in recorded history, but during the African humid period between 8,000 and 5,000 BCE, when the Sahara was green and Egypt received heavy seasonal rainfall, the groundwater table would have been substantially higher. The pattern repeats across the ancient world. In Lebanon, the temple complex at Baalbek features foundation stones weighing up to 1,500 tons, the largest worked stone blocks ever quarried by any civilization, ancient or modern. The Romans built a temple complex on top of these megalithic foundations around 2,000 years ago, but they didn't construct the platform itself. Roman engineering was sophisticated, but they never attempted to move stones exceeding 50 tons. The foundation blocks at Baalbek are 30 times that weight. Roman sources describe the platform as already ancient when they arrived, calling it the Tower of Babel and attributing it to antediluvian giants. Medieval Arab historians recorded similar traditions, describing the structure as pre-flood work built by jinn at the command of a legendary king. In Peru, the fortress of Sacsayhuaman overlooks Cusco, built from limestone blocks weighing up to 200 tons, fitted together in the same polygonal masonry style as the Osirian. The Inca claimed they didn't build the lowest, most massive layers of the fortress. They found them already in place and constructed their own buildings on top using smaller stones and different techniques. Spanish chroniclers recorded this distinction, noting that the bottom layer seemed far more ancient than the Inca structures above it. When archaeologists excavated the site, they found the same pattern, evidence of sustained water erosion on the megalithic foundation blocks, but not on the later Inca additions built on top. The same construction techniques appear on Easter Island, in Malta, in Sardinia, in India. In Japan, megalithic structures built with a precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate, all showing similar characteristics: massive stone blocks, polygonal masonry, minimal decoration, evidence of water damage, and local legends attributing them to gods, giants, or pre-flood civilizations. These aren't isolated anomalies. They're a signature, a fingerprint of a construction methodology that spread across the globe, appearing in cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other, built during time periods when such precision stonework shouldn't have been possible according to our understanding of technological development. What if these structures weren't built by separate cultures independently developing similar techniques? What if they're the remnants of a single civilization's knowledge, preserved and copied by survivors who understood that certain things — temples, astronomical observatories, survival bunkers — needed to be built in a way that could withstand the next cataclysm? The megalithic structures share more than construction techniques. They share purpose. Many are aligned to astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, stellar risings. Many sit at elevations above ancient floodplains. Many show evidence of having been deliberately buried or sealed before catastrophe struck. And many were later reused by younger civilizations who built their own structures on top, preserving the foundations even when they no longer understood the original purpose. The architecture of immortality wasn't designed for comfort or beauty. It was designed to survive. Massive stones resist earthquakes better than small blocks. Polygonal masonry flexes during seismic events instead of collapsing. High elevations avoid flood damage. Deliberate burial protects from erosion. The builders understood something we're only now beginning to appreciate, that civilizations end, but information encoded in stone can persist for tens of thousands of years if constructed correctly. These weren't temples in the sense we understand them. They were time capsules, built to outlast the catastrophe, preserving the knowledge that sophisticated engineering, astronomical measurement, and organized labor were possible because they had been possible before, because someone had done it first and taught others how to preserve the technique. Every culture that survived long enough to develop writing recorded the same event. Not similar events, not metaphorical representations of seasonal flooding or mythological explanations for the existence of water, but the same catastrophic inundation, described with such consistent detail across continents and millennia that dismissing it as coincidental invention requires more faith than accepting it as memory. The Sumerians called it the Abzu Rising. The Akkadians described the god Enlil's fury unleashed through deluge. The Hebrews wrote of 40 days and nights of rain that covered the highest mountains. Hindu texts describe Manu receiving warning from a divine fish before waters consumed the world. Chinese legends tell of Gunyu battling the great flood that threatened to drown all civilization. Native American tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Plains preserve stories of a world-ending deluge that survivors escaped by climbing to high mountains or building boats. The conventional academic response to these universal flood narratives has always been that humans naturally feared water, that early agricultural societies experienced periodic river flooding, and that these localized events became exaggerated into cosmic catastrophes through the distortion of oral tradition. This explanation sounds reasonable until you examine the details. The flood accounts don't describe rivers overflowing their banks or seasonal inundations. They describe a planetary event, waters rising from beneath the earth and falling from the sky simultaneously, submerging mountains, lasting for specific durations measured in days or lunar cycles, and leaving behind a fundamentally changed world. The survivors universally describe having advance warning from divine sources, receiving specific instructions to preserve knowledge and genetic diversity, and emerging into a devastated landscape where previous civilizations had been erased. The Mesopotamian accounts are particularly detailed because they're the oldest written records we possess. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis, and the Sumerian flood tablet all describe Utnapishtim, or Ziusudra, in the earlier Sumerian version, receiving warning from the god Ea. The warning is specific. The Council of Gods has decided to destroy humanity with a flood, but Ea violates this decision by whispering instructions through the reed walls of Utnapishtim's house. He's told to abandon his possessions, build a boat with precise dimensions, and bring aboard the seed of all living things. The boat must be sealed with bitumen inside and out, a waterproofing technique that wouldn't make sense for describing ordinary river flooding. but is essential for ocean-going vessels encountering sustained wave action. The flood lasts 7 days and 7 nights, after which Utnapishtim sends out birds to test for dry land, eventually making landfall on Mount Nimush. Compare this to the Hebrew account in Genesis, written thousands of years later in a completely different language and cultural context. Noah receives warning from God, builds an ark with specific dimensions, waterproofs it with pitch, brings aboard breeding pairs of animals, experiences a flood lasting 40 days of rain, plus 150 days of water prevailing over the earth, sends out birds to test for dry land, and makes landfall on Mount Ararat. The structural parallels are too precise to be coincidental. Both accounts describe cubical or rectangular vessels, both specify waterproofing, both mention animal preservation, both use bird messengers, both involve mountain landings. The differences are in cultural interpretation and theological framework, but the underlying event being described is identical. Now examine the geological record and the academic embarrassment becomes acute. Around 10,800 BCE, the planet experienced a catastrophic climate shift called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Ice cores from Greenland show a dramatic spike in platinum, iridium, and other rare Earth elements that only appear in significant concentrations from extraterrestrial sources. A black sediment layer containing carbon spherules, magnetic microspherules, and nanodiamonds appears across North America, Europe, and Asia, dated precisely to this period. These are impact signatures, evidence that one or more large objects from space struck Earth's atmosphere, potentially fragmenting over the ice sheets covering northern North America and triggering immediate and catastrophic climate change. The immediate effects would have been devastating. Impacts on ice sheets don't create traditional craters. They vaporize the ice, releasing trillions of tons of water instantly. The meltwater would have raised sea levels rapidly while simultaneously disrupting ocean currents and weather patterns. The resulting temperature fluctuations appear clearly in ice core data. A sudden drop in global temperatures of around 15 degrees Celsius in some regions, followed by rapid warming, all occurring within decades rather than the gradual changes typical of normal climate cycles. Megafauna that had survived multiple previous ice ages went extinct during this narrow window. Woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American camels and horses, all vanishing from the fossil record simultaneously across multiple continents. The flood wasn't metaphor, it was stratigraphy. Across the Middle East, archaeologists have identified a distinct sediment layer dating to approximately 10,800 BCE, a boundary between two different archaeological periods marked by a thick deposit of waterborne silt. This layer appears at multiple sites: Ur, Uruk, Shuruppak, Kish. It's not uniform depth, which rules out slow alluvial deposition from normal river activity. The depth varies based on local topography, with deeper deposits in valleys and thinner layers on elevated ground, exactly what you'd expect from a massive flood event that inundated the landscape before receding. Below this layer, archaeologists find evidence of sophisticated pre-flood settlements. Above it, there's a cultural discontinuity. The post-flood inhabitants rebuilt on the same sites but using different techniques, different pottery styles, different architectural approaches. The human genetic record tells the same story from a different angle. Population geneticists have identified a bottleneck in mitochondrial DNA dating to approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, a period when the effective breeding population of humans dropped dramatically, suggesting a catastrophic reduction in overall population. This isn't evidence of near extinction, but it indicates that a significant percentage of existing human lineages died out simultaneously across multiple geographic regions. The survivors who contributed to modern human DNA represent a small subset of the pre-bottleneck diversity. Consistent with the flood narratives describing small groups of survivors rebuilding human civilization from remnant populations. But here's what makes the ancient texts genuinely unsettling. They don't just describe the flood as a natural disaster, they describe it as selective elimination. The Mesopotamian accounts are explicit about this. The gods decided to destroy humanity because humans had become too numerous, too noisy, too troublesome. But certain individuals received warning and protection. Utnapishtim was chosen to survive specifically to preserve knowledge and biological diversity. The implication is that someone with sufficient technological sophistication to predict the catastrophe chose to warn specific individuals while allowing the broader population to perish. This isn't the behavior of natural disaster. This is the behavior of controlled population reduction with intentional preservation of essential genetics and knowledge. The Sumerian King List provides the timeline with bureaucratic precision. 8 kings reigned before the flood for astronomical durations totaling 241,200 years. Then, the flood swept over. After the flood, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, the kings reigned for progressively shorter periods: 1,200 years, 960 years, 840 years, declining with each generation until they reached normal human lifespans. The text doesn't describe the flood as interrupting continuous human development. It describes the flood as marking the end of one epoch and the beginning of a diminished one. Before the flood, the Anunnaki walked among humans, taught them arts and sciences, established cities, measured time in cosmic cycles. After the flood, the Anunnaki are absent. The kings who claim descent from them are mortal, ruling kingdoms built on ruins they didn't create, preserving knowledge they inherited but couldn't replicate. The waters rose, the mountains were covered. The world that existed before was erased. But something survived. Not just humans, but information, preserved in the architecture that stood above the floodline, encoded in astronomical measurements that could be recalculated from naked eye observations, embedded in myths that survivors told their children, who told their children across hundreds of generations. The flood narratives aren't describing the end of humanity. They're describing the end of the Anunnaki, the disappearance of the beings who the ancients insisted were not myths, but memories, and the desperate struggle of survivors to preserve fragments of what was lost when the waters finally receded. In the basement archives of Columbia University sits a clay tablet, roughly the size of a postcard, catalogued as Plimpton 322 after the collector who donated it in the 1930s. Its surface is covered with cuneiform numerals arranged in 4 columns and 15 rows, creating what appears to be a simple accounting record or administrative document. For decades after its acquisition, scholars assumed it was exactly that, another mundane example of Babylonian bookkeeping from around 1800 BCE. But in 1945, mathematician Otto Neugebauer examined the tablet more carefully and discovered something that should have been impossible. The numbers weren't recording grain stores or temple inventories. They were listing Pythagorean triples, sets of 3 integers that satisfy the equation a squared plus b squared equals c squared, calculated with such precision and arranged in such systematic order that they revealed knowledge of trigonometry 1,200 years before the Greeks supposedly invented it. Pythagorean triples are the foundation of right-angle geometry. The most famous example is 3, 4, 5. 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 25, which is 5 squared. These numbers allow you to create perfect right angles without sophisticated measuring tools, which is why ancient builders used them for constructing temples, laying out cities, and surveying agricultural land. But Plimpton 322 doesn't just list a few simple triples that someone might stumble upon through trial and error. It contains 15 complex triples, including numbers like 12,709, 13,500, and 18,541, arranged in descending order of their angular values from approximately 45 degrees down to approximately 30 degrees. This isn't accidental discovery. This is systematic mathematical exploration, the work of people who understood abstract numerical relationships and possessed computational techniques sophisticated enough to generate these numbers deliberately. The tablet presents another problem that makes modern mathematicians uncomfortable. The Babylonians used base 60 arithmetic, the sexagesimal system we inherited in our 60-minute hours, and 360-degree circles. This system is computationally efficient for a civilization without calculators, because 60 is highly divisible. You can divide it evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. But working in base 60 requires either extensive memorization of multiplication tables or sophisticated understanding of fractional arithmetic. The scribes who created Plimpton 322 were performing calculations that modern students struggle with using calculators, and they were doing it in clay with reed styluses, showing no correction marks, no trial and error scratches, no evidence of computational difficulty. The mathematics appears fully formed, executed with casual competence by people who treated advanced trigonometry as routine administrative work. Now, consider another tablet, designated as YBC 7289, housed in the Yale Babylonian collection. This tablet contains a diagram of a square with its diagonals marked, accompanied by numerical annotations that calculate the square root of 2 with extraordinary accuracy. The Babylonian approximation equals 1.41421296, correct to 6 decimal places. Modern calculators give the value as 1.41421356. The ancient scribes were off by less than 1/millionth. They achieved this precision using a computational algorithm that mathematicians didn't rediscover until the 16th century, an iterative method for refining approximations of square roots that requires understanding of both arithmetic and geometric progressions. This wasn't lucky guessing. This was algorithmic mathematics, the kind of systematic problem-solving approach we associate with computer programming, not with Bronze Age clay tablets. The mathematical sophistication extends beyond geometry into astronomy. Tablet BM 36731, part of the British Museum's cuneiform collection, contains calculations of Jupiter's position in the night sky using geometric methods that involve computing the area under a curve representing the planet's velocity over time. This is essentially calculus, specifically the geometric intuition underlying integral calculus, appearing in Babylonian astronomical texts from approximately 350 BCE. European mathematicians didn't develop similar techniques until the 14th century CE, and calculus as we know it wasn't formalized until Newton and Leibniz in the 17th century. The Babylonian astronomers weren't performing the same abstract mathematical operations, but they had discovered the geometric principles that make calculus work, and they were applying them to predict planetary motion with precision that rivals modern ephemeris calculations. The question becomes impossible to ignore. Where did this knowledge come from? The standard model of mathematical development suggests gradual accumulation. People count objects, develop arithmetic, slowly build toward more abstract operations, eventually discover geometric principles through practical application, and finally achieve the conceptual breakthrough necessary for higher mathematics. This process should take centuries, leaving clear archaeological evidence of progressive development. Egypt shows this pattern with hieratic numerals evolving from hieroglyphic symbols, Greek mathematics building visibly on Egyptian and Babylonian foundations, and European algebra developing step by step from Arabic sources. But Mesopotamian mathematics appears in the archaeological record with no visible evolution. The earliest Sumerian tablets from around 3000 BCE already contain place value notation, sexagesimal arithmetic, and geometric calculations. There are no practice texts, no pedagogical tablets showing students learning to count or struggling with basic operations. The mathematical system appears complete and functional from its first appearance. The Sumerian term for their mathematical knowledge was Nam-shesh, which translates roughly as understanding of measurement or knowledge of proportion. But the texts describe this knowledge as having been given by the Anunnaki, specifically by the god Enki, who the Sumerians credited with teaching humanity the arts of civilization, including writing, mathematics, agriculture, and law. The creation myths don't describe humans gradually developing these skills through innovation. They describe the Anunnaki actively teaching survivors after the flood, transmitting knowledge that already existed in complete form. The tablets function as textbooks, preserving mathematical techniques for future generations who might need to reconstruct civilization again after the next catastrophe. Consider what this implies. A civilization sophisticated enough to develop sexagesimal mathematics, trigonometry, algorithmic computation, and geometric calculus would need centuries of astronomical observation, extensive record-keeping, institutional knowledge preservation, and sufficient social stability to support a class of professional scribes and calculators. These aren't skills that emerge from subsistence farming or nomadic hunting. They're the products of urban civilization with surplus resources, specialized labor, and long-term continuity. Yet the Sumerians claim their cities were built on pre-existing foundations. Their knowledge inherited from pre-flood instructors, their mathematical system a preservation of techniques taught by beings who no longer walked among them. The mathematical tablets serve another crucial function, their verification. You can lie about history, embellish mythology, misremember oral traditions, but mathematics doesn't deceive. Either the calculations work or they don't. Either the geometric principles produce accurate constructions or they fail. The Pythagorean triples on Plimpton 322 are verifiably correct. The square root approximations are demonstrably accurate. The astronomical predictions match observed planetary positions. This isn't mythology that requires faith to accept. This is technical documentation that proves sophisticated mathematical knowledge existed in Mesopotamia 3,800 years ago, knowledge that shouldn't exist according to our model of how civilizations develop mathematical literacy. And the tablets keep appearing. Archaeologists have excavated approximately 500,000 cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamian sites, but only a tiny fraction have been translated and studied. The mathematical tablets discovered so far likely represent a small sample of the total corpus. Each new translation reveals additional sophistication, algorithms for compound interest calculations, solutions to quadratic equations, geometric series, methods for extracting cube roots. The depth of Babylonian mathematics keeps expanding as we examine more tablets, suggesting that what we've found so far isn't the pinnacle of their knowledge, but merely the surviving fragments that happen to be preserved in contexts archaeologists have excavated. The Anunnaki didn't leave gold or jewels or monuments inscribed with their names. They left mathematics, the one language that transcends cultural context, that any sufficiently advanced civilization will rediscover, that proves beyond doubt that sophisticated abstract thinking existed in the ancient world. The numbers don't require you to believe in gods or accept mythological narratives. They simply demonstrate, with the cold certainty of geometric proof, that someone in the distant past understood things they shouldn't have been able to understand, calculated things they shouldn't have been able to calculate, and preserved this knowledge in forms designed to survive the next cataclysm. The tablets aren't ancient superstition. They're instruction manuals, written by people who knew the world would end again and wanted to give survivors the tools to rebuild. The ice remembers what we have forgotten. Deep in the Greenland ice sheet, in cores drilled through thousands of meters of accumulated snowfall representing hundreds of thousands of years of climate history, there exists a distinct boundary layer that shouldn't be there. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas boundary, dated to approximately 10,800 BCE, and it contains concentrations of platinum, iridium, osmium, and other platinum group elements at levels 50 to 100 times higher than background. These elements are rare in Earth's crust, appearing in significant quantities only in two contexts: deep mantle material brought to the surface by volcanic activity, or extraterrestrial material delivered by comets and asteroids. The Greenland ice contains no volcanic ash from this period. The platinum came from space. This discovery, first published in 2007 by a team of researchers examining sediment cores from multiple North American sites, triggered immediate controversy. The hypothesis it suggested was too catastrophic, too sudden, too disruptive to accepted models of gradual climate change. According to the evidence, one or more large objects from space, likely fragments of a disintegrating comet, struck Earth's atmosphere around 10,800 BCE, with multiple impacts occurring across the Northern Hemisphere. The largest impacts likely struck the Laurentide ice sheet covering North America and the Scandinavian ice sheet covering Northern Europe. When you impact ice rather than rock, you don't create a permanent crater. You vaporize trillions of tons of frozen water instantly, releasing it as superheated steam that condenses into torrential rainfall, while simultaneously creating pressure waves that fracture surrounding ice sheets, accelerating their collapse into the oceans. The immediate effects would have been apocalyptic. The heat pulse from atmospheric entry and impact would have ignited widespread wildfires across North America, Europe, and Asia. Evidence for this appears in the form of a black matte layer containing carbon spherules, charcoal, soot, and glass-like carbon, signatures of biomass burning at extremely high temperatures. This layer has been identified at more than 50 sites across 4 continents, always dated to the same narrow window around 10,800 BCE. The smoke and ash from continent-wide fires would have blocked sunlight, creating a sudden cooling effect even as the impacts themselves triggered a massive ice sheet collapse. The resulting climate chaos appears clearly in ice core data. Temperatures dropped by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in some regions within decades. Ocean currents shifted dramatically, and weather patterns became violently unstable. But the most devastating immediate effect was water. The vaporized ice had to go somewhere, and it went into the atmosphere as water vapor before precipitating as rain. Not normal seasonal rainfall, but sustained, heavy precipitation that continued for weeks or months. Geological evidence supports this interpretation. Across the Middle East, North Africa, and the Mediterranean basin, there exists a sediment layer from this period showing characteristics of rapid, aqueous deposition, fine silt laid down by fast-moving water, erosion patterns indicating sustained high water levels, and marine microfossils appearing in previously terrestrial sediment layers. The flood described in ancient texts wasn't metaphorical. It was the direct result of atmospheric impacts vaporizing ice sheets and dumping the resulting water back onto the surface in concentrated precipitation events that overwhelmed drainage systems and flooded coastal regions as sea levels rose rapidly from ice sheet collapse. The extinction data tells the same story from the biological perspective. The late Pleistocene megafauna extinction event occurred precisely during the Younger Dryas period, eliminating approximately 35 genera of large mammals in North America and 15 genera in South America within a geological instant. Woolly mammoths that had survived multiple previous ice ages disappeared. Giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American lions, dire wolves, short-faced bears, American camels, American horses, all vanished from the fossil record between 11,000 and 10,000 BCE. The extinction pattern isn't gradual decline from climate stress or human hunting pressure. It's sudden cessation, with abundant fossil evidence right up to the boundary layer and then nothing. Something killed them all at once. Across multiple continents, regardless of habitat or diet or reproductive strategy. Human populations show the same pattern. Archaeological sites across North America associated with the Clovis culture, the dominant human population in the Americas during this period, show continuous occupation until approximately 10,800 BCE, then abandonment. The distinctive Clovis spear points that appear abundantly in pre-impact layers become rare or absent after the boundary. The few sites showing continued occupation after the impact show evidence of severe population reduction, dietary stress, and technological regression. In Europe, the Magdalenian culture that created the sophisticated cave paintings at Lascaux and Altamira experienced similar disruption, with major sites abandoned and artistic production ceasing abruptly. In the Middle East, the Natufian culture that was transitioning from hunter-gathering to early agriculture shows a clear break in the archaeological record, with pre-impact settlements characterized by stone architecture and grain processing facilities giving way to simpler post-impact occupations using different pottery styles and construction techniques. The genetic evidence provides independent confirmation. Studies of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers show a severe population bottleneck in human populations dating to 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. The effective breeding population, the number of individuals who successfully contributed genetic material to subsequent generations, dropped dramatically across multiple geographic regions simultaneously. This wasn't gradual population decline from disease or resource competition. This was sudden, catastrophic reduction in total population, with only small survivor groups in certain regions maintaining genetic continuity. The bottleneck appears in populations separated by oceans and continents, suggesting a global rather than regional catastrophe. And the genetic diversity that existed before the bottleneck, carried by lineages that didn't survive to contribute to modern populations, represents knowledge, culture, and possibly entire civilizations that were erased without leaving descendants. But here's what makes the Younger Dryas boundary truly significant for our investigation. It marks the disappearance of the Anunnaki from the historical and archaeological record. Before this date, we find megalithic architecture requiring sophisticated engineering knowledge, astronomical calculations of extraordinary precision, mathematical systems appearing fully formed, and mythological texts describing gods walking among humans and teaching civilization. After this date, we find survivors rebuilding on ruins they didn't create, copying techniques they couldn't fully replicate, preserving mathematical knowledge they inherited without understanding its origins, and writing flood narratives that describe divine beings who warned select individuals before vanishing when the waters rose. The Sumerian King List draws its definitive line at exactly this point. Before the flood, kings reigned for astronomical durations. After the flood, kingship was lowered from heaven, and human rulers reigned for progressively shorter periods. The archaeological sites that show continuous occupation through the Younger Dryas boundary reveal something crucial. The settlements that survived were predominantly at high elevation: mountain valleys, plateau regions, highland areas above the maximum flood extent. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey sits at approximately 2,500 feet elevation. The pre-dynastic sites in Egypt that show evidence of pre-flood occupation are concentrated on the high desert plateau rather than the Nile floodplain. The Andean sites in South America that contain the oldest megalithic foundations are all at elevations above 10,000 feet. The pattern suggests intentional selection. Someone knew which locations would survive the coming catastrophe and either built there deliberately or moved populations to high ground before the impact. The flood narratives describe exactly this: divine warnings instructing survivors to move to high ground or build vessels to escape the rising waters. The impact wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a reset button for human civilization, erasing the accumulated knowledge and infrastructure of whatever civilization preceded the catastrophe. The survivors emerged into a devastated world where most of the previous population was dead, where coastal settlements and lowland cities were buried under sediment, where megafauna that had been hunted for millennia were extinct, and where the climate had become violently unstable. They preserved what they could: fragments of mathematical knowledge, astronomical observations, construction techniques, agricultural practices, but they could no longer create what their predecessors had built because the builders themselves were gone. The Anunnaki, whoever or whatever they were, didn't survive the 13,000-year cataclysm. What survived was memory, encoded in stone monuments, mathematical tablets, and flood narratives that all point to the same conclusion. Before the impact, something greater existed. After the impact, only echoes remained. Beneath the known cities of the ancient world lie older foundations that defy our comfortable timeline of human development. Archaeologists have known this for over a century, but the implications have been carefully filed away under the category of anomalies. Interesting but not paradigm-threatening, curious but not civilization redefining. Yet when you examine these underground layers with the hypothesis that they represent pre-cataclysm construction, the anomalies stop being random and start forming a pattern. The pattern suggests that every major city of the ancient Near East was built on top of ruins from an earlier civilization, and that the builders who came after were not innovators, but preservationists, desperately trying to maintain structures whose original purpose they no longer fully understood. Start with Uruk. The city the Sumerians claimed was the first city built after kingship was lowered from heaven following the flood. The conventional archaeological dating places Uruk's founding around 4000 BCE, with the earliest monumental architecture, the great ziggurat dedicated to the sky god An, constructed around 3200 BCE. But excavations at the site reveal something unsettling. Beneath the earliest Sumerian levels lie foundation layers built using different construction techniques, employing larger stones and showing evidence of water erosion that shouldn't exist in southern Mesopotamia's arid climate. The ziggurat itself isn't built on virgin soil. It's built on a massive artificial platform composed of earlier construction material, deliberately raised above the surrounding terrain, as if the builders knew flooding was a persistent threat. The Sumerian texts describe this explicitly. The city wasn't founded by humans but rebuilt by them on foundations the gods had established before the deluge. Travel north to Göbekli Tepe, which we discussed earlier, and consider what happened after the temple complex was completed. Around 8000 BCE, the builders deliberately buried the entire site under thousands of tons of fill dirt, creating artificial hills that protected the structures from erosion and concealed them from looters or destroyers. This wasn't accidental abandonment. This was intentional preservation, the act of people who knew their civilization was ending and wanted to protect knowledge for whoever came next. The buried temples remained hidden for 10,000 years until modern excavation techniques revealed them. And here's the crucial detail. The pottery and stone tools found in the fill material used to bury the temples are more primitive than the artifacts found in the temples themselves. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe had less sophisticated technology than the people who built it. They were preserving something they could no longer create. In Egypt, the pattern repeats with even more dramatic evidence. The Sphinx enclosure, the massive rectangular pit from which the Sphinx was carved, shows clear signs of precipitation-induced erosion on its limestone walls. Geologist Robert Schoch examined these erosion patterns extensively in the early 1990s and concluded they could only have been created by sustained rainfall, not wind-blown sand or occasional flooding. The erosion channels are vertical, deep, and consistent with centuries of water runoff during a period when Egypt received heavy seasonal precipitation. The last time the Giza Plateau experienced such rainfall was during the African humid period, which ended around 5500 BCE, more than 2,000 years before Egyptologists claim the Sphinx was carved during the 4th dynasty around 2500 BCE. The dynastic Egyptians didn't build the Sphinx. They found it already weathered by millennia of rain, and they restored it, adding the head that appears disproportionately small for the body because they were recarving a severely eroded original. Beneath the Valley Temple at Giza, which sits adjacent to the Sphinx, the foundation blocks show the same weathering pattern. Water erosion on megalithic limestone blocks that shouldn't have been exposed to heavy rainfall, according to conventional dating. The temple itself presents another anomaly. The interior walls are bare limestone, completely undecorated, showing none of the hieroglyphic inscriptions or painted reliefs that characterize every other temple from the 4th dynasty. The only inscriptions that exist are crude later additions, scratched onto the walls by New Kingdom pharaohs, claiming credit for construction they didn't perform. The original builders left no writing, no royal cartouches, no dedication inscriptions, just massive stone blocks fitted with precision that later Egyptian architecture never matched. The temple functions as a time capsule from a pre-hieroglyphic period, built before the writing system existed, or by builders who had no need to sign their work because everyone knew who created it. The same phenomenon appears at Abydos, where the Osirian sits 20 feet below current ground level, buried under centuries of Nile silt accumulation. When archaeologists first excavated the structure in 1903, they found it flooded with groundwater, requiring continuous pumping to expose the interior. The structure shows evidence of prolonged submersion, water staining on the walls, erosion of the softer limestone elements, and sediment deposits consistent with the space having been underwater for extended periods. Yet the Osirian sits in a location that hasn't flooded in recorded history. The Nile's annual inundation never reached the elevation necessary to submerge the structure under 20 feet of water. The only period when water levels would have been high enough was during the African humid period, when increased rainfall raised the regional water table significantly. This places the Osirian's construction thousands of years earlier than the 19th dynasty pharaoh Seti I, who built the temple directly above it and claimed the underground structure as his own. In South America, the fortress of Sacsayhuaman near Cusco presents the same pattern. The lowest layer of the massive stone walls, blocks weighing up to 200 tons fitted together in precise polygonal masonry, shows weathering characteristics completely different from the upper levels added by the Inca. The megalithic foundation blocks exhibit water erosion, mineral staining from prolonged moisture exposure, and surface pitting consistent with centuries of heavy precipitation. The Inca additions built on top show no such weathering because they were constructed during the relatively dry period of the past 1,000 years. Spanish chroniclers recorded the Incas' own testimony. They found these foundations already in place, built by a previous civilization they called the Wari, or attributed to the god Viracocha, who taught humanity the arts of civilization before departing across the Western Ocean. The Inca were maintaining and building upon ruins they inherited, not creating original architecture. At Baalbek in Lebanon, the situation becomes even more extreme. The massive platform stones, the largest weighing approximately 1,500 tons, form the foundation of the Roman Temple of Jupiter, but Roman sources explicitly state they didn't construct the platform. They built on top of existing foundations they attributed to pre-flood giants or legendary pre-Roman civilizations. Medieval Arab historians recorded similar traditions, describing the platform as ancient even in Roman times, built by kings who possessed technology and knowledge that later ages lost. The stones themselves present an engineering challenge that no documented ancient civilization successfully solved. Moving a 1,500-ton block requires lifting capacity, transport mechanisms, and placement precision that strain even modern heavy equipment capabilities. Yet there the stones sit, placed with such accuracy that joints between blocks measure less than a millimeter. The genetic evidence adds another layer to this mystery. Studies of ancient DNA recovered from human remains in the Near East show distinct genetic discontinuity around the Younger Dryas boundary. Pre-impact populations show genetic markers that are rare or absent in post-impact populations, suggesting the survivors who rebuilt these cities weren't direct descendants of the original builders, but remnant groups from different regions who migrated into devastated areas after the catastrophe. They inherited ruins, copied what they could understand, and built their own structures on top, using inferior techniques and smaller stones. The architectural regression is visible in the stratigraphy, massive megalithic foundations at the bottom, progressively smaller stones and cruder construction techniques in the layers above. As if each successive generation had less skill and knowledge than the one before. Every major ancient city follows this pattern, an impossibly sophisticated foundation layer showing evidence of pre-flood construction, covered by progressively cruder later additions, with the later builders claiming divine ancestry or divine instruction, but unable to replicate what they inherited. The cities weren't built from scratch by emerging civilizations learning to urbanize. They were rebuilt by survivors occupying ruins, copying plans they found carved in stone, preserving knowledge they received as religious instruction because they no longer understood it as engineering documentation. The ancients weren't primitive people inventing civilization. They were survivors trying desperately not to lose it again. There exists a category of ancient texts that scholars find deeply uncomfortable to discuss, not because they're fragmentary or poorly translated, but because they're too clear, too specific, too deliberate in their bureaucratic precision. These are the pre-flood warning texts, tablets that describe with administrative efficiency the final preparations before catastrophe struck. written in the same matter-of-fact tone Mesopotamian scribes used to record grain inventories and tax assessments. The most famous is the Atrahasis, a Babylonian poem dated to approximately 1700 BCE, but clearly copied from much older Akkadian sources, which themselves reference even earlier Sumerian originals. The text doesn't present the flood as divine surprise or sudden wrath. It presents it as planned elimination with advance notification provided to select survivors who received specific technical instructions for preservation and reconstruction. The Atrahasis describes a council of gods deliberating humanity's fate. The complaint is specific. Humans have become too numerous and too noisy, disturbing the sleep of the gods. The god Enlil proposes a solution: send a flood to reduce the population to manageable levels. But the god Enki, who the Sumerians credited with teaching humanity civilization, objects and decides to warn his human servant Atrahasis. The warning doesn't come as a dramatic revelation or divine vision. It comes as a whisper through reed walls, a covert communication from someone who wants to help but must operate within constraints that prevent direct intervention. Enki tells Atrahasis to tear down his house, abandon his possessions, and build a boat with specific measurements and construction details. He's told to seal it with bitumen, provision it with food and water for an extended voyage, and bring aboard breeding pairs of animals to preserve biological diversity. The instructions are engineering specifications, not religious metaphor. The boat must be square in plan, 7 stories high, with each level divided into compartments. The dimensions are given in cubits with such precision that modern naval architects have analyzed the proportions and determined the resulting vessel would have been remarkably stable, with a low center of gravity and high resistance to capsizing. Exactly what you'd want for riding out sustained rough seas. The 7 levels aren't arbitrary symbolism. 7 corresponds to the classical planets, suggesting the boat functioned as a cosmic model, a 3-dimensional representation of astronomical knowledge that needed to be preserved. Atrahasis is told to gather not just his family, but craftsmen, specialists who possess technical knowledge, people who can rebuild civilization after the waters recede. But here's the detail that transforms this from mythology into historical documentation. The text describes a specific timeline. Atrahasis is given 7 days to complete construction. During those 7 days, he works continuously while receiving regular updates about the impending catastrophe. The text describes unusual atmospheric phenomena preceding the flood: darkness at noon, thunder without clouds, strange lights in the sky. These descriptions match exactly what you'd expect from a large object entering Earth's atmosphere: electromagnetic disturbances, atmospheric compression heating, and visible fragmentation of an incoming comet or asteroid. The ancient scribes didn't have vocabulary for celestial impacts. So they described what they saw using available language: fire in the sky, mountains trembling, the fabric of heaven tearing open. The Epic of Gilgamesh provides a parallel account with additional technical details. Utnapishtim describes receiving the same warning from the god Ea, who speaks to him through a reed fence. The instructions are nearly identical: build a cube-shaped vessel, waterproof it thoroughly, load it with provisions and breeding stock. But Gilgamesh adds something the Atrahasis doesn't mention. Utnapishtim is told to bring aboard the artisans of the city, the craftsmen who possess specialized knowledge. He's specifically instructed to load the boat with silver and gold, not for personal wealth, but as portable, concentrated value that can be used to restart commerce and trade after the catastrophe. He brings seed grain, agricultural implements, and most significantly, he brings tablets, written records that preserve mathematical, astronomical, and agricultural knowledge. The flood itself is described with the precision of an eyewitness account. The waters rose for 6 days and 7 nights, coming from above and below simultaneously, precisely what would happen if atmospheric impacts vaporized ice sheets while simultaneously triggering tsunami events and catastrophic rainfall. The description mentions that the gods themselves were terrified by what they had unleashed, cowering like dogs and wailing at the destruction. This detail is crucial. The text doesn't present the gods as omnipotent cosmic forces, but as beings who made a catastrophic mistake and watched in horror as it exceeded their expectations. They possessed enough astronomical knowledge to predict an impact event, enough authority to warn select individuals, but not enough power to prevent or control the resulting devastation. Now consider what this implies about the Anunnaki's final days. They knew the catastrophe was coming with at least 7 days advance warning, possibly longer. They had sufficient astronomical observation capabilities to track incoming objects and calculate impact trajectories. They possessed the authority and communication systems to disseminate warning to chosen survivors across multiple cities. They provided specific engineering instructions for building survival vessels, indicating they understood fluid dynamics, structural stability, and the requirements for long-duration ocean survival. And they made a choice, a calculated decision about which humans to warn, which knowledge to preserve, and which locations offered the best survival probability. This wasn't random chance or divine caprice. This was disaster management by beings who understood exactly what was coming and had limited resources to prepare for it. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. At Göbekli Tepe, the deliberate burial of the temple complex around 8000 BCE coincides with the later stages of the Younger Dryas climate instability. The builders didn't abandon the site due to resource depletion or population decline. They methodically filled in the temple enclosures with clean fill dirt, creating artificial mounds that would protect the structures from erosion, looting, and weather damage. This is preservation, not abandonment, the act of people who knew their civilization was ending and wanted to protect critical information for whoever came next. The buried temples contained no human remains, no garbage deposits, no evidence of casual use. They were sealed like time capsules, waiting for a future generation with sufficient technological sophistication to excavate and understand them. In Egypt, the evidence becomes even more explicit. The inventory. Stela, discovered at Giza in the 19th century, describes Pharaoh Khufu ordering repairs to the Sphinx after it was damaged by lightning. The inscription explicitly states that the Sphinx already existed when Khufu ascended to the throne, making it far older than the 4th dynasty around 2500 BCE. But the stela contains another detail that scholars typically dismiss as impossible. It describes Khufu finding chambers beneath the Sphinx that contained tablets, astronomical instruments, and records from before the flood. Whether or not these specific chambers exist, and ground-penetrating radar has detected multiple anomalies beneath the Sphinx that remain unexplored, the inscription describes exactly what you'd expect if the pre-flood civilization deliberately buried knowledge repositories before the catastrophe struck. The Sumerian King List provides the bureaucratic framework for understanding this transition. The text doesn't say the Anunnaki died in the flood. It says kingship was lowered from heaven after the flood, implying the Anunnaki no longer ruled directly, but maintained some form of distant oversight or periodic contact. The post-flood kings claimed divine ancestry and received divine legitimation for their rule, suggesting they maintained some form of connection to surviving Anunnaki or inherited authority structures the Anunnaki established. But the kings themselves were clearly mortal, ruling for human lifespans and struggling to maintain technologies and knowledge systems that declined with each generation. The pattern suggests the Anunnaki survived the initial catastrophe but couldn't sustain their presence afterward, whether due to reduced population, loss of infrastructure, environmental changes, or deliberate withdrawal. The last transmission wasn't a farewell message. It was an instruction manual, encoded in multiple formats to ensure some version would survive. The mathematical tablets preserved computational techniques civilization would need to redevelop. The astronomical observations provided baseline data for recalculating calendars and tracking celestial cycles. The flood narratives explained why the world had changed and warned future generations that catastrophe could recur. The megalithic architecture demonstrated engineering principles using materials that couldn't decay or be destroyed. And the myths themselves, the stories of gods teaching humanity civilization before departing, preserved the core truth that knowledge isn't innovation, but inheritance, that every achievement of post-flood humanity was recovery of something that existed before, that we aren't the first to reach for the stars because someone else had already been there and fallen back to Earth. The human genome tells a story that archaeology alone cannot reveal. Within the 3 billion base pairs of DNA that define what it means to be human, geneticists have discovered something deeply unsettling. Evidence of ancestral populations that contributed significantly to our genetic makeup, but left no archaeological trace, no artifacts, no skeletal remains that we've identified. These are called ghost populations in academic literature, contributor lineages that show up in statistical models of human ancestry, but vanish from the physical record as if they never existed except as genetic memory preserved in the chromosomes of their descendants. The timing of these phantom contributions clusters around a specific period, 10,000 to 15,000 years ago. Precisely when the Younger Dryas catastrophe reshaped the planet, and when the Anunnaki supposedly vanished from human history. Modern population genetics uses sophisticated computational models to trace ancestry by comparing DNA sequences across different ethnic groups and analyzing patterns of genetic variation. When you find shared genetic markers between populations separated by geography, you can calculate approximately when they diverged from a common ancestor. When you find genetic sequences that don't match any known ancient population, but appear in multiple modern populations, you've discovered evidence of a ghost population, people who contributed their DNA to your ancestry, but whose bones and artifacts have not been found or identified. The standard explanation is that these populations lived in regions where preservation conditions were poor, or that we simply haven't excavated the right locations yet. But another possibility presents itself when you correlate the ghost population's signatures with the catastrophe timeline. What if these populations weren't lost to poor preservation, but to intentional erasure? Their cities and settlements obliterated by the same cataclysm that ended the pre-flood world. The most significant ghost population appears in the ancestry of modern Near Eastern populations, the peoples of Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran, who live in the regions where the Sumerian and Akkadian civilizations emerged after the flood. Genetic studies identify a major ancestral component in these populations that doesn't match any known ancient Near Eastern culture we've excavated. This phantom ancestry contributed approximately 20 to 30% of the total genetic makeup of early Bronze Age Mesopotamian populations, appearing suddenly in the archaeological DNA record around 8,000 to 9,000 BCE, precisely the period when survivors would have been rebuilding after the Younger Dryas impacts. The ghost population's genetic signature suggests they were distinct from both the earlier hunter-gatherer populations of the region and the later agricultural populations that dominated after 6000 BCE. They appear in the genetic record, make significant contributions to subsequent populations, and then disappear without leaving identified archaeological remains. The European genetic record shows a parallel pattern. Ancient DNA extracted from Neolithic farming populations in Europe reveals a mysterious ancestral component that appears around 8000 BCE and becomes progressively diluted in later populations. This ghost ancestry is distinct from the indigenous hunter-gatherer populations of Europe and distinct from the Anatolian farmers who migrated into Europe during the Neolithic expansion. It's a third component, appearing at exactly the right time to represent survivors of a pre-flood civilization that experienced severe population reduction during the Younger Dryas. The genetic signal is strongest in populations from highland regions, the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Caucasus, exactly where you'd expect survivors of catastrophic flooding to have taken refuge, and exactly where megalithic monuments showing sophisticated astronomical alignments appear in the archaeological record. Now turn from DNA to stone, and the pattern becomes even more striking. Across the globe, from Göbekli Tepe to Stonehenge, to the temples of Malta, to the pyramids of Giza, megalithic monuments built during the period immediately following the Younger Dryas show astronomical alignments to star positions that were accurate, not when the monuments were supposedly built, but thousands of years earlier. The Great Pyramid at Giza, conventionally dated to 2500 BCE, contains air shafts pointing towards specific stars. The southern shaft of the King's Chamber aimed at Orion's belt, the northern shaft aimed at what was then the pole star. But when you calculate backwards to determine when those shafts would have pointed exactly at those stars, accounting for precession of the Earth's axis, you arrive at approximately 10,500 BCE, 5,000 years before the pyramid was supposedly constructed. Either the builders of the Fourth Dynasty possessed astronomical knowledge sophisticated enough to calculate star positions from 7,000 years in their past, or the pyramid's design incorporates measurements taken from an earlier period and preserved through the catastrophe. The Sphinx presents the same chronological problem. The constellation Leo rises directly east of the Sphinx during the spring equinox, and ancient Egyptian texts explicitly connect the Sphinx with Leo, calling it Hor-em-Akhet, the horizon of Horus, associated with the lion. But precession means that Leo only rises due east at the spring equinox during specific epochs. Calculate backwards to find when Leo would have been perfectly aligned with the Sphinx's eastward gaze at dawn on the spring equinox, and you arrive at approximately 10,500 BCE, the exact same period indicated by the water erosion on the Sphinx enclosure walls. The monument wasn't aligned to Leo symbolically or mythologically. It was aligned astronomically, carved to face the constellation during a specific, precessional epoch that had long passed by the time of dynastic Egypt. Stonehenge in England shows similar temporal displacement. The monument as it exists today was constructed in multiple phases between 3000 and 2000 BCE, but the astronomical alignments encoded in its structure, particularly the alignments to solstice sunrise and sunset, only work perfectly when calculated for approximately 9000 BCE. The builders weren't creating original astronomical observations. They were reconstructing alignments that someone had recorded thousands of years earlier, preserving astronomical knowledge that had survived the catastrophe in the form of written records, oral traditions, or templates carved in more ancient monuments that served as references. The temple complex at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, conventionally dated to the 12th century CE, encodes in its layout a map of the constellation Draco as it appeared in 10,500 BCE. The temples aren't randomly placed. Their positions correspond exactly to the stars of Draco at that specific epoch, accounting for precession. Either the Khmer builders possessed astronomical archives going back 12,000 years, or they were copying a layout that originated in the pre-flood period and had been preserved through successive civilizations as sacred geometry, passed down as religious instruction long after the astronomical rationale was forgotten. These aren't isolated anomalies. They're a systematic pattern appearing in monuments across every continent. Astronomical alignments that don't match their supposed construction dates, but do match the pre-flood period around 10,500 BCE. The builders weren't innovating. They were commemorating, copying, preserving measurements taken by predecessors who possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge and wanted future generations to know exactly when their civilization flourished. The alignments function as timestamps carved in stone, immune to the decay of written records. Preserved through the catastrophe by survivors who rebuilt monuments incorporating data they inherited, but could no longer generate themselves because the long-term observational programs required to develop such knowledge had been interrupted by the cataclysm. The genetic phantom populations and the astronomical displacement align perfectly when you accept the premise that both represent the same phenomenon. Survivors of the Anunnaki civilization rebuilding human society after the Younger Dryas catastrophe. The ghost populations are the refugees, the remnant groups who carried Anunnaki genetic admixture and technical knowledge into post-flood human populations. They don't appear in the archaeological record as a distinct culture because they integrated into surviving populations, teaching them agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and architecture as they had been taught by the Anunnaki before the flood. Their genetic contribution was significant but diluted over subsequent generations. Their cultural contribution was transformative, creating the sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge in populations that supposedly had no prior foundation for such advancement. The survivors weren't starting civilization from scratch. They were desperately trying to preserve what they remembered from before the catastrophe, encoding astronomical data in monument alignments, preserving mathematical knowledge in clay tablets, maintaining oral traditions about the time when gods walked among humans and taught them the arts of civilization. Every post-flood achievement, writing, agriculture, monumental architecture, astronomical calendars, legal codes, appears too suddenly, too completely formed, too sophisticated to represent independent innovation by people just emerging from Stone Age hunter-gathering. These achievements were restoration, not invention, the work of populations carrying genetic and cultural memory from a pre-flood world where such knowledge was commonplace because the Anunnaki had made it so. When the waters receded and the survivors emerged from their high mountain refuges and their sealed vessels, they found themselves in a devastated world. The cities that had stood for thousands of years were buried under sediment. The agricultural systems that had fed millions were erased by saltwater intrusion and soil erosion. And most significantly, the Anunnaki who had walked among humans, teaching and guiding and maintaining the infrastructure of advanced civilization, were gone. What remained was memory, fragmentary, incomplete, transmitted through oral tradition by people who understood that they were preserving something essential but could no longer fully comprehend what they were preserving or why it mattered. This is the moment when human civilization, as we know it, began, not as innovation, but as desperate recovery. Not as invention, but as imperfect copying by students whose teachers had vanished. The phenomenon anthropologists call cargo cults provides a perfect modern analogy for understanding what happened in the post-flood world. During World War II, Allied forces built air bases on remote Pacific islands, bringing manufactured goods, metal tools, medicine, and canned food to indigenous populations who had never seen industrial technology. The islanders watched airplanes arrive carrying miraculous cargo, observed the rituals the soldiers performed, radio operators speaking into boxes, ground crews waving signal flags, commanding officers giving orders, and understood that these rituals somehow caused the cargo to appear. Then the war ended, the soldiers left, and the cargo stopped coming. The islanders, desperate to restore the flow of goods, built replica airstrips from bamboo and palm fronds. They carved wooden headphones for radio operators and fashioned antennas from vines. They performed the rituals they had observed, speaking into wooden radios and waving signal flags, hoping to summon the cargo planes back. They were copying behaviors whose purpose they didn't understand, preserving forms without comprehending the underlying mechanisms that made those forms functional. This is precisely what happened after the Anunnaki disappeared. The survivors had watched sophisticated agricultural systems operate, had seen astronomical observations being conducted, had witnessed architectural projects being executed, and had participated in administrative systems that required writing, mathematics, and record-keeping. They understood that these activities were important, that they sustained civilization, but they didn't fully understand the theoretical foundations or the systematic knowledge that made these technologies work. So they copied what they remembered. They built temples on the foundations of older temples because the original locations had been carefully chosen for astronomical alignments or geological stability. They preserved mathematical tablets by recopying them generation after generation, maintaining numerical traditions they could apply practically but couldn't derive independently. They told stories about gods teaching humanity the arts of civilization, because that's exactly what had happened, and the stories were the most reliable method for ensuring knowledge transmission across generations who would never meet the original teachers. The sudden appearance of agriculture around 10,000 BCE is conventionally explained as independent innovation by multiple populations who figured out plant and animal domestication through trial and error. But the evidence doesn't support gradual development. The earliest domesticated crops, wheat, barley, rice, maize, appear in the archaeological record already optimized for human consumption through selective breeding that would have required centuries of careful cultivation to achieve. Wild wheat has seeds that shatter and disperse when ripe, making it nearly impossible to harvest efficiently. Domesticated wheat has tough rachees that keep seeds attached to the stalk until harvesting. This trait doesn't occur randomly. It requires sustained artificial selection over multiple generations by people who understood they were trying to modify plant genetics to produce a more useful crop. The same pattern appears in domesticated animals. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs all show genetic modifications that make them more docile, more productive, and more dependent on human care than their wild ancestors. This isn't accidental domestication by hunter-gatherers stumbling into farming. This is sophisticated selective breeding by people who understood genetic principles well enough to deliberately modify organisms. The appearance of writing follows the same pattern. The earliest writing systems, Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Chinese characters, don't evolve from simple pictographs to complex scripts. They appear fully formed with complete grammatical structures, extensive vocabularies, and standardized symbols that show no evidence of experimental development. The Sumerian script from 3200 BCE includes abstract phonetic symbols, grammatical markers, and technical terminology that shouldn't exist in the first generation of a writing system. Someone didn't invent this script. someone reconstructed it from memory or copied it from older examples. Preserving a system whose original development had taken centuries, but whose final form could be replicated quickly by people who understood that writing was essential for maintaining administrative control, preserving knowledge, and conducting long-distance communication. The legal codes present perhaps the most striking example of inheritance rather than innovation. The Code of Hammurabi from 1800 BCE is often cited as one of humanity's first legal systems, containing 282 laws, covering everything from property rights to medical malpractice to construction standards. But Hammurabi himself states in the prologue that he's codifying and preserving laws that already existed, that the gods had given these laws to humanity in earlier times, and that his role is merely to organize and inscribe them for his subjects. The laws themselves show sophistication that shouldn't exist in an early legal system. Nuanced distinctions between intentional and accidental harm, graduated punishments based on social status and circumstances, complex property law that assumes sophisticated commerce and ownership concepts. These aren't laws being invented by a society just learning to govern itself. These are laws being preserved by a society trying to maintain standards inherited from predecessors who had already solved these problems. The Sumerian King List provides the framework for understanding this transition with brutal honesty. Before the flood, kings reigned for astronomical durations while the Anunnaki walked among humans. After the flood, kingship was lowered from heaven, meaning the Anunnaki were no longer physically present but maintained some form of distant authority or oversight. The early post-flood kings still claimed divine descent, still performed rituals to maintain connection with the vanished gods, still built temples at locations the Anunnaki had designated as sacred. They were trying to maintain legitimacy by demonstrating continuity with the pre-flood authority structures, showing they were proper inheritors of divine mandate rather than usurpers. But the kings themselves were clearly mortal, ruling for human lifespans and struggling to maintain systems that became progressively less sophisticated with each passing generation, as the knowledge inherited from the Anunnaki was diluted, misunderstood, or lost entirely. The post-flood world was a world of survivors living in the ruins of a greater civilization, surrounded by monuments they couldn't replicate, using technologies they couldn't fully explain, preserving knowledge they could apply but not extend. This is why ancient civilizations seem obsessed with the past rather than the future, why their texts constantly reference earlier golden ages and times when gods walked the earth, why their greatest achievements are reconstructions and restorations rather than innovations. They weren't primitive people, gradually learning to be civilized. They were inheritors desperately trying not to lose what they had been given, copying templates preserved in stone and clay and oral tradition, maintaining rituals whose original purposes they no longer understood, because the rituals were all they had left of the teachers who had vanished when the waters rose. We are still living in that post-flood world. Every achievement of human civilization, writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, architecture, law, is inheritance from the survivors who preserved fragments of pre-flood knowledge through the catastrophe. We think of ourselves as the pinnacle of human development, the most advanced civilization that has ever existed, but we're only now beginning to rediscover knowledge that the Anunnaki possessed 13,000 years ago. We're only now developing technologies sophisticated enough to recognize that ancient monuments encode astronomical data we can verify, that ancient tablets contain mathematics we can reproduce, that ancient texts describe catastrophes we can confirm geologically. The survivors weren't telling stories, they were preserving data, encoding it in forms that could survive the next reset. warning us that civilization is fragile and knowledge can be lost completely if we don't maintain it deliberately. What remained after the gods was us, inheritors struggling to understand our inheritance, survivors trying to remember what we were taught before the teachers vanished. The question isn't whether the Anunnaki existed. The evidence is everywhere once you know how to read it. The question is whether we'll recognize that evidence in time to prepare for the next catastrophe, whether we'll preserve our knowledge more successfully than they preserved theirs, whether we'll survive the next reset with enough intact that future generations can rebuild without spending millennia recovering what we lost. Because the pattern is clear. Civilizations rise, fall, and rise again. And what remains after each fall determines how far the next rise can reach.
If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe, and activate notifications so you don't miss our next videos.